Thanks so much, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Kelsey Gallagher, and I'm a senior researcher with Project Ploughshares, where indeed my work focuses on the arms trade writ large, primarily the Canadian arms trade, and for the greater part, or for more than a year now, in particular, the Canadian Israeli arms trade. Um, for those of you that aren't familiar with Project Ploughshares, so we're one of Canada's, if not one of Canada's oldest, if not the oldest, peace and disarmament research organizations. So I'm here in my capacity as lead researcher on the arms trade, but we also have research streams on nuclear disarmament, as well as outer space security, the protection of civilians, and new technologies, autonomous weapons, etc. So please check us out. Consider supporting us. We can be found at www.plowshares.ca. All right, so to kind of zoom out a little bit, and I'm sure some of the audience here would know this, but to look at kind of more of the structure of the Canadian arms trade historically. So Plowshares has maintained data sets on Canadian military exports for decades, and we can see here that Canada's transfer of conventional weapon systems to Israel is nothing new. So this graph goes back to 1978. And this shows the total annual value of arms exports directly being transferred from Canada to Israel. We can see that things reached a high point towards the latter part of the 1980s before going into nil values for a number of years, trickling up in the mid 90s, and then looking to the latter part of the graph on my right, you can see that we've reached a bit of a fever pitch in terms of the total annual overall value of Canadian arms exports to Israel. So last year, 2023, the year which we have the most recent data for direct Canadian arms exports was actually the highest ever year on record for Canadian military transfers to Israel, exceeding $30 million. And again, for this audience, I don't think it's any mystery why it's problematic for Canada to be sending weapon systems to Israel. Since following the October 7 attacks and the onset of Israel's current operation in Gaza, which is extended to obviously other parts of Palestine as well as into Lebanon now, Israel has consistently violated international humanitarian law, which is also known as the laws of armed conflict or the laws of war, which is kind of the bedrock of how you have to treat not only combatants but primarily civilians while conducting combat. Israel's gone so far as to, some of these instances are likely war crimes. It should be noted. So when we're talking about, it being bad for a country like Canada to arm a country like Israel, which consistently violates IHL, it's not only kind of true in and of itself, but it's also a violation of international law as well as domestic law. So just to give a bit of an overview of Canada's arms control obligations as they exist today. So Canada is a states party of the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, or the UNATT, and Canada has been a states party to this UN global framework since September 2019. The ATT itself actually just recently celebrated its 10th birthday in August. So the ATT is a bit of it's certainly an innovative tool at the international level. This was the first binding treaty to regulate the trade and transfer of conventional weapon systems, specifically looking through the lens of human rights. So under Article 7.3 of the ATT, Canadian officials shall not authorize arms exports if there's an overriding risk that such transfers would undermine peace and security or could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian or human rights law. Evidently, this line has been crossed, not only considering Israel's conduct in its current operation since October 7th, but also arguably before that. So we've talked about from a bird's eye view at least, Canada's historical and current transfer of weapon systems directly to Israel. We've also did a broad overview of Canada's arms control obligations at the international level. And I should note that these are also reflected in domestic law. This does, however, leave out a huge and very problematic part of the story that is the Canada-Israel arms trade, and those are those weapon systems that are indirectly transferred to Israel by way of the United States. So. The United States, and it shouldn't really be of any surprise in any typical year, the United States is actually the biggest, the primary consumer of Canadian-made weapon systems. This is a long-running structural relationship where really the U.S. and Canadian defense industry should not be thought of as separate entities. This is, primarily, including in the defense industry, they actually view both of these industries as one integrated North American defense industrial base. So much of the weaponry that is produced in the United States actually relies upon components and subcomponents that are produced here in Canada. And what we can see here is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, particularly the F-35I. So this is an aircraft that Israel has openly bragged about using across Gaza since October 7th, saying it's very effective in conducting airstrikes. This is particularly problematic considering that the majority of civilian harm events that have happened in Palestine since October 7th have been driven by airstrikes, and we know that the F-35 is conducting airstrikes. In terms of Canada's industrial contribution to the F-35, we have Canadian ministers, for instance, as well as Lockheed Martin Canada, bragging that in every jet there's more than $3 million of Canadian technology integrated into each aircraft, which we can only take to include those aircraft that are later exported to Israel. The largest issue from a regulatory perspective with the Canada-US-Israel arms trade is that the vast majority of Canada's arms exports to the United States are not regulated. This is absolutely in violation of Canada's binding obligations under the UN Arms Trade Treaty. But due to the integrated nature of the North American defense industrial base, and also it should be said, due to significant lobbying by the arms industry, again, the vast majority of Canadian arms exports to, and in this case, through the United States, meaning those that are transferred to Israel, are not subject to human rights considerations. There is very little transparency afforded to them, which leaves civil society organizations like Ploughshares really trying to read the tea leaves and interpreting the true value of Canadian arms exports to Israel, considering such a large percentage of these are transferred through the United States. So to give an overview of what Canadian policy looks like today in regard to Canadian arms exports to Israel, I would say that there's been a significant amount of if not disinformation, that's been propagated by Canadian officials on exactly what is happening in terms of Canada's material contribution to the conflict in Gaza. We've had Canadian officials, including the foreign minister, the minister of national defense, the prime minister, saying different things at different times, sometimes seemingly deliberately obfuscating exactly what's happening in terms of Canada's export of weapon systems to Israel. So to offer a little bit of a timeline here, this is from my perspective, and this is a very truncated timeline, mind you. There's, just in the interest of time here and also real estate on a computer screen, we can only fit so many boxes. On the top of this graph, we can see, things that have happened from the government of Canada's perspective, and on the bottom of this timeline, we can see some civil society actions, which did not include, or I failed to include the F-35 Day of Action on Saturday. But to go back to kind of the beginning of the most recent bout of violence, for lack of a better term, October 7th, the October 7th Hamas attack occurs, which itself obviously and evidently was a war crime, right? Targeting civilians deliberately at any time is a war crime. And thereafterwards, within a couple days, the Israeli operation began in Gaza. And in the opening days following the October 7 attacks, we immediately started talking to a lot of our colleagues at humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, disarmament organizations, and it was essentially agreed that Israel's response was going to be asymmetric. Israel was really going to go to the extreme end and potentially try to destroy Gaza. And unfortunately, I can say that the general agreement around that was that we were correct. So in the immediate days following the onset of Israel's operation, Canadian civil society organizations immediately started organizing, saying we need to put research out, we need to put joint letters out, and really we hit the ground running in trying to get out in front of this thing. Um, Fast forwarding to January 2024, this was not made public at the time, but the Government of Canada and Global Affairs Canada, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, kind of silently introduced an informal policy to no longer authorize further arms exports to Israel. This was, and to give an overview of this policy, this does not stop the transfer, the actual export of weapons to Israel. It only means that new arms exports are not going to be approved. So fast forwarding a few months to March 2024, some of you might remember this. I remember this night. There was a new Democratic Party sponsored opposition motion in Parliament that called for, amongst other things, a full embargo on Israel, an arms embargo. That language throughout the night, this was it ended up turning into a late night vote in Parliament, kind of got watered down. But the language as it related to arms exports was still very strong. It called for all arms exports to Israel to stop and for the government of Canada to not authorize further arms transfers, which would effectively be a one-way arms embargo. That motion passed to everyone's surprise, including myself. We had Prime Minister Trudeau and Foreign Minister Joly even endorse the motion again, which is still surprising to me. But the time for celebration was short because we found out the next day that the government of Canada was actually interpreting this motion in its own way, and it was not going to indeed stop actual arms exports to Israel. It was just going to continue pausing new export permits. And around this time is when we discovered the January 2024 policy. It was made public. It was actually leaked to the media that the government of Canada was no longer authorizing new arms exports. So fast forwarding to August 2024, there was an announcement, not by the government of Canada, it was actually by the U.S. Department of Defense that a Quebec-based manufacturer called General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems Canada, or we call it GDOTS Canada, had won a contract through the rather infamous U.S. Foreign Military Sales Program, or the FMS program, to supply $61.1 million worth of mortar cartridges, essentially mortar rounds, to Israel. This would absolutely fly in the face of Canada's purported policy to not provide lethal weapons to Israel, which of course it was anyways. And then we saw the government of Canada kind of move quickly on this. And fast forward there afterwards, finally to September 2024. I'm just going to touch on the top part of the timeline in the interest of time. And Foreign Minister Joly announced that Canada had suspended around 30 export permits to Israel, and that it had actually informally moved to block this U.S.-sponsored mortar deal. So where does that leave us today? Like, what is the government of Canada actually doing today? So Canada's current policy. Canada has suspended the approval of new export authorizations to Israel. From what we can tell, this policy still exists. And so this means that Canada is not allowing the defense industry, arms manufacturers, to basically enter into new contracts. Canada has suspended around 30 existing export permits to Israel sometime this summer. That was the exact words of Foreign Minister Joly. We don't know what permits they were. We don't know the exact number, and we don't know exactly when this happened. But it is good to see that Canada had suspended some existing permits. The current policy has also introduced an ad hoc block of one mortar contract through the United States. This is, from my perspective, likely unprecedented, if not very, very rare. I'm not aware of another case of Canada doing this, so it was good to see that happen. But more importantly, in my opinion, is what does the current policy not do? And I think this is where the focus has to be, and this is what we need to see change from government officials, not only if officials don't want to contribute to the genocide in Gaza, but also if they don't want to breach international law, which they're currently doing. Canada's current policy does not implement a formal transparent policy denying the authorization of arms exports to Israel. In cases where the government of Canada has taken very quick action on stopping the transfer of weapon systems to human rights abusers, we saw this for a time with Turkey. We've seen this with Belarus, and we've also seen this with Russia since following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The government of Canada very quickly moves to implement what's called a presumption of denial policy, which means that no new arms transfers will be approved. The government of Canada has not, this is a very odd move, but the government of Canada has not published any such policy. They've actually not published their policy on Israel whatsoever for more, for approaching a year. So we're not actually very clear with what the policy is. And that leads me to my next point. The government of Canada has suspended some existing export permits to Israel, but they have not revoked export permits themselves. They've not canceled them. For practitioners in the arms control and disarmament space, a suspended permit is a permit that's waiting to be reinstated, and that's how we should view these pieces of paper that the government of Canada are ostensibly not going to allow to go forward. Anytime that there is an overriding risk that a weapons transfer could be used in human rights abuses, the government of Canada needs to cancel these permits, and that's not what it's done. Finally, the government of Canada has failed to stop the indirect transfer of Canadian-made material through the United States. This really is the biggest loophole in Canada's arms control policy, and this is a conduit through which Canadian arms manufacturers are continuing to arm a country that is credibly accused of committing war crimes. To say that this is inappropriate is an understatement because, again, this is a breach of international law on several levels. So for us, I mean, this is the critical thing that needs to be addressed. I will end there. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A, but my friends will let me know if I went too over time. This is a publication we released almost a year ago where we kind of where I endeavored to lay out the risks associated with the F-35. And I should note that we actually should have, this is not public yet, but we should have a working paper out in the next few weeks that will build on these findings. And I would invite everyone to visit us at ploughshares.ca, and we encourage any support. Thank you so much.